So now that you've learned how to use an inject node, let's take a look at the way we use the inject node in combination with the Alpaca nodes to get the kind of data, useful trading data that we're going to require. So let's turn now to a new flow, flow 2, which is empty. I'm going to bring in an inject node, and now I'm going to bring in some Alpaca nodes. So I type in Alpaca here in the palette, and it brings up the various endpoints. So you can see there's quite a few of them, several dozen. Basically, there is a node here that corresponds to every endpoint in the Alpaca API. Again, these are all pre-written, they're tested, they all work, saving a huge amount of time if you sit down and try to create your own trading platform in Python or some other language. And let's first of all take a look at the position query. So this is an Alpaca position query. You need to assign it to an account. So we're going to assign this to the paper account. And deploy this. I'm going to connect the wire here. And I'm just going to call this, I'll give it a name, I'll say display position. So this will show me any positions that are in the the Alpaca paper account. And we're going to have to put a debug node at the end of this so we can see it displayed. So you can see I have one position open, and that is for the symbol FGen, and it says that I've got a short position of 2,100 shares. So that's how I've displayed that particular position. Now, instead of, there's another way to use we can avoid using the debug node if we use a function node. So I'm going to get the debug node, and what I'm going to do is say here, I'm going to write node warn. Now, if you've had any exposure to programming, you've probably seen the statement print. When you want to print something, you want to send that essentially to the debug and display it. In Node-RED, we use node warn to display something. So if I put quotes, this so now when I display this, this will display what I wrote here. Now in this case, what we want to do is to get Node-RED's convention is to send values from one node to the next through something called the message payload. So rather than saying node warn and then a script, I'm just going to put message payload. And then if I put a couple slashes in front of it, that'll turn that off so that doesn't show. Now in this case, this should display the output from the positions query. So this is actually identical to what we saw in the debug node. But instead of using the debug node, we use a function node that with a little JavaScript to define what we want. This is helpful because oftentimes I'm going to want to store the result. So the way we store things in Node-RED is we use variables, either flow, so let's do flow set, and this could be, we'll just name this positions, and then we're going to put message payload. So what this is going to do is this will actually store those values in a variable called positions. So I can retrieve this and use this elsewhere in my flow, which is something that happens all the time. So this is kind of a useful thing to have. So here I've displayed my object. If I go to one of the context variable, which is this kind of stack of cylindrical stack, this shows you all the stored values. And if I display it here, you can see I have a flow variable called positions, and I have the object stored here. So now I can retrieve this elsewhere in the flow. I could also store this, the other way to store it is a global. So you could say global. And then this will store positions as a global variable called positions. I'm not going to do that now because there are other things in those globals already that I don't want to overwrite. Okay, so that's how I've retrieved the position. Now, often another thing that's oftentimes you want to do is to get the price of a stock. So let's get it. We'll start it with another inject node, and I'm going to say get the price. Say I want to get the price of SPY. In this case, I send message symbol SPY using a string node. I can get rid of the timestamp, so you can see I don't really need that. And now I want to bring up the Alpaca, an Alpaca price node. So one is the Alpaca last trade. This will bring up the price of the last trade. Again, I have to set this to either paper or live. I'm sending it SPY. And I should be able to display that. I'll just copy this because this is another thing that's very fast. It's copying nodes rather than copying code. And I'm going to call this last trade. Go back to the debugger. I'll clean it out. Okay, and you can see now this has given me information about the last trade for SPY, for this ticker. The price, the size, conditions, so, and then a timestamp. So at this particular time now, notice this, I'm actually running this on a Sunday, which means that the most recent price will be the end of the last trade on Friday, which was the 7th of February at 21:07. So that was the last trade that took place. Now there are other ways of getting to. You could also ask for the last quote. So this is an Alpaca data last quote node. So we use paper here. Actually, I'll call this last trade, so it's not confusing. And we'll store this as last quote. Okay. So the last quote was at 21:58 on Friday. Now if I go to my context data, I should now see three positions. I've got my last quote, I've got my last trade, and I got my position. So those are all stored, and those can all be retrieved and used very easily. In fact, I can use an inject node to do that. I'm going to call this get. Okay, so I'm going to send in the message payload here. I'm going to ask for the flow variable, last quote, and then if I attach a debug node to that, return to the debug panel, you can see I've retrieved this. So that's how easy it is to get stored variables and use them elsewhere. There's also, Alton, I'll show you another way to get this, which is instead of asking for it in the payload, let's get rid of this. I'm going to ask a function node for it. So the way we get it here is we say flow get, and then the name of the variable we're looking for, which is last quote. And I want to display this, so I'm going to say node warn and surround that by parentheses. So you can see I get the same result that I got above here. The difference here now, though, is what we can do is we may want to use this value in our flow. So I'm going to define a variable. I'm going to call this last quote. And in JavaScript, you start a definition with let last quote equal, and in this case, I'm going to ask for flow get. So what I've done here is I'm stored this as a variable, last quote, and then I displayed it by saying node warn last quote. So that's yet another way. Oftentimes in a flow you want to get these values, and you need so you're going to want to define them as variables to be able to save them. So that's some basics on retrieving Alpaca endpoints for last trade, last quote, and position.